For my learning journal, I chose to create a video in a way that I believe embodies the concepts of the Haida words for to teach and to learn. In order to express my learning to others, or to teach Sk'ad'ada, I need to engage in research and reflection, which deepened my learning, Sk'ad'a, which is at the root of teaching.
This relationship between teaching and learning is an important concept to Sarah Davidson Florence, who co-wrote the book Potlatch's Pedagogy with her father, Robert Davidson. According to the practices and traditional knowledge passed on through the generations, Florence defines key characteristics of Haida pedagogy, stating that it is impossible to teach without learning. From this philosophy comes the 9 Sk'ad'a principles of the Haida peoples, including the idea that learning emerges from strong relationships, like that of her and her father, authentic experiences, and curiosity. This foundation also builds on the concept that learning occurs through observation, contribution, and recognizes and encourages strengths. Finally, Sk'ad'a honors the power of the mind, Indigenous history and stories, as well as spirituality and protocol. But it is important to note that Sarah's father would often state that he was born in just the nick of time. Robert Davidson saw a void. He saw that there was very little Haida artwork left in his village, the written history of his peoples. So he wanted to fill that void, the gaping cultural void that was left in the wake of colonization. Since first contact of white Europeans with indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, or what is now known as North America, there has been more than 500 years of violence, appropriation, discrimination, assimilation, and broken promises. But in order to indigenize our understanding of this process, we need to understand what it was like pre-contact. Indigenous peoples did not have a conception of land ownership. They acted as stewards of the land, and there was a universal respect for the earth, as well as the resources that it provides us. Ignacio Torres reminded us in his talk about the far-reaching colonial violence that has taken place in the South and beyond. He taught us about the value that the Aztec people placed on the land and resources, like the seed, which represents life. But we as settlers have become disconnected from that land and lost consciousness of what holds real value. The process of displacement took place from the north to the south, stripping indigenous peoples of their ways of life. It is impossible to understand the current state of Indigenous realities without acknowledging the terrible impact of colonization, but more specifically, the residential schooling system in what is now known as Canada. From the late 1800s until the decline of residential schools in the 1950s, this is one of the darkest periods in Canadian history, a time of large-scale assimilation policies attempting to permanently resolve the Indian problem. An approximated 150,000 children were put through the residential schooling system, many of whom were subject to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. For more than 100 years, Indigenous children were robbed of their language and culture, creating a cycle of intergenerational trauma that many still carry with them to this day. More than 6,000 children died while attending these residential schools, from poor living conditions to murder, suicide, or attempted escapes. Many of the children went missing and were never found, buried in unmarked graves, parents not informed until months later. Worse yet, the government knew about these conditions when they were happening. They were aware of the child mortality rates but did nothing to stop it at the time. But the cultural violence didn't end there. Throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in what is now known as the 60s scoop, upwards of 10,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families, another form of assimilation policies. The void in cultural knowledge that is left behind has been devastating, nothing short of cultural genocide. Tanya Talaga speaks about the 7 truths of the Anishinaabe peoples: love, bravery, humility, wisdom, honesty, respect, and truth. She reveals that the reality for many Indigenous youth today is that attending high school itself is an act of bravery. Youth often need to leave their homes and go to unsafe communities where they're left at risk of abuse or even murder. Talaga wrote her book, 7 Fallen Feathers, about the murdered and missing Indigenous children from Thunder Bay and how their murders were ignored by the local authorities. Systemic racism towards Indigenous peoples still takes many forms to this day, from inadequate resources, sanitation, and infrastructure on reserves, to inequitable educational opportunities, jobs, and political representation. This systemic abuse and discrimination has fragmented many Indigenous communities, but they still stand strong and fight for a better future. The rate at which cultural revitalization is taking place within and between Indigenous communities across Canada is a testament to the warrior spirit of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples on Turtle Island. More people are coming from all across these lands to participate in organizing, activism, and ceremony. First Nation peoples travel far and wide to participate in modern and traditional powwows, where celebration, food, songs, dance, and stories are shared. a vast amount of cultural knowledge, including languages, ceremonies, and practices, grow stronger and contribute to their shared and individual cultural heritage and identities. Throughout the thousands of years spent on Turtle Island, the pluralism of Indigenous peoples has persisted. But much of the cultural and ceremonial knowledge and languages of Indigenous peoples are left hanging on by a thread. Florence and Davidson believe that if we come together, that each of our individual threads represents our connection to the past, and through the act of gathering for traditional ceremonies, Indigenous peoples have the power to create a thick rope that links them to their ancestors through lived history. That's why the ban on potlatch, among other traditional ceremonies, as part of the legislation of the Indian Act, was such a devastating blow to Indigenous communities. But still they resisted. They practiced in secret even when Indian agents threatened them with harsher punishments. They fought to maintain their honor. Their spiritual beliefs are what helped shield them from the violence that was taking place. Now is the time for growth, resurgence, revitalization, and continued resistance. There's a need for strong leaders to step forward and for us to redefine our conception of the warrior. We need the voices of strong Indigenous women as spiritual leaders to show us the path forward and help us heal from the wounds of the past. The inclusion of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer folks is essential to the healing and decolonization of our hearts and minds, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. For decades, Indian agents policed Indigenous people's bodies, personal lives, and sexuality. The heteronormative patriarchal standards of monogamous Christian marriage have shamed and hurt so many. By devaluing female strength, criminalizing and punishing the diverse spectrum of our sexuality and gender identities, colonial perceptions of normativity have warped the self-perception of countless queer folks on Turtle Island. It's time for Indigiqueer peoples to reclaim their power and honor. Great strides have been taken on behalf of the Canadian government in recent years to reconcile for what's been done through the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission has exploded into numerous initiatives, publishing the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, the creation of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, and publishing the final TRC report, just to mention a few of the actions that have been taken. But the real truth is that the work is only beginning. It will require much more effort on behalf of the Canadian government and greater inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and voices in order to create a more equitable future for all Canadians. But discrimination often means turning a blind eye. There are still 94 calls to action, only a few of which have been seriously addressed or even raised to public awareness, and there is still discriminatory legislation in place, like the Indian Act itself, that until resolved will leave the efforts of the government feeling like another false promise, like those of the treaties that were signed so many years ago and thought of as a thing of the past. We are all treaty people. Whether settler or Indigenous, we have a promise to withhold. Ignacio Torres reminded us that if we do not know our history, it is doomed to repeat itself. It is our responsibility now as settlers to bear witness to the errors of our ancestors. As we continue to learn Sk'ad'a and teach Sk'ad'ada, we can continue growing our knowledge and connection to each other. In order to create a true path forward, we need non-Indigenous peoples, or settlers like myself, to actively dismantle these systems of oppression that our ancestors have created. But in order to dismantle white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalist greed, we need Indigenous pedagogy, Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous voices to be empowered, to be recognized, respected, and truly heard by all the peoples of these lands, in order for the government to take these calls to action seriously. I have learned that there is hope. But we need action now if we want to actualize our shared vision of a more equitable future for all Indigenous peoples in this land now known as Canada.